Welcome to this presentation on a 5-attribute complex adaptive systems framework for reinvigorating organizations. I'm Pravir Malik of Deepwater Technologies, and this paper has been co-authored with Natty of Galaxies and Josh Wall of Nucor. And today it's being presented via this pre-recorded presentation at the International Conference on Interdisciplinary Research on Technology and Management. Now, in this presentation, I'm going to go over some introductory concepts. I'll review briefly the 5 attributes of a complex adaptive system that we have leveraged. I'll speak about the relevancy of CAS in business. And here, complex adaptive systems, we will refer to as CAS in the rest of the presentation. I'll offer some guidance on implementing CAS, and then share a little bit about a couple of case studies, and finally conclude. So in terms of introductory concepts, we know that complexity is in everything. And when we look at any phenomena or observe a situation or circumstance, it can seem that there's a lot of chaos in that situation. But if we look deeply enough, there is in fact a profound order in any chaos. And if we look deeply into this profound order, that's the starting point for potentially glimpsing complex adaptive systems, or CAS, because we will find that complex adaptive systems is a particular case in which seeming contradiction will continue to yield positive results. So for example, in a robust economy, even though it appears that there's a lot of contradictory phenomena and dynamics going on, yet we will find that year after year, that robust economy continues to create new jobs and continues to grow and offer positive results to the populations involved. And therefore, we might conclude that it in fact is an instance of a complex adaptive system only because the contradiction is yielding positive results. Now, some examples of complex adaptive systems, or CAS, are corporations, societies, ecosystems, civilizations, theories, economies, amongst other such systems and frameworks. Now, what CAS allows us to do, or what complex adaptive systems allows us to do, is essentially provide new sight that allows for reinvigoration. So imagine that you have a system in front of you, or that you are operating in a system that appears to be decaying. The moment that we can view this same decaying system with a new sight, then that itself becomes a mechanism by which reinvigoration can take place. And so by employing complex adaptive systems, we are in fact invoking new sight that will allow for reinvigoration. Now, the attributes that we'll in particular go over in this paper and presentation are those of self-organization, distributed control, interconnectivity, authenticity, and emergence. We've chosen these attributes because as practitioners, we find that each of these attributes amongst the many that CAS offer are practical and have yielded positive results when implemented in the way that we've described in this paper. Now, some of the advantages of using this framework, this 5-attribute complex adaptive systems framework, to reinvigorate organizations is that it'll increase variety without increasing complexity. It offers continuous improvement, increases efficiencies, and so on. Now, going a little deeper into the 5 attributes themselves, self-organization can be thought of as that phenomena when elements can self-organize from the bottom up. So usually in an organization, the kind of control that exists will dictate how organization should occur from the top down. But when elements are allowed to self-organize from the bottom up, then that really is this attribute of self-organization, and it proves to be very important in a complex adaptive system. Similarly, in a complex adaptive system, we will find this phenomena of distributed control, where essentially organizations can operate successfully without little or no centralized control. Interconnectivity points to the dynamic where there's robust interaction between the organizational elements, and that itself creates phenomena of complexity. Authenticity can be understood as the dynamic by which agents or independent entities within the complex adaptive system can self-express and create, and therefore can create new rules that help to create and improve a system. So this is in contrast. So if you look at the literature in complex adaptive systems, common examples are that of beehives and ant colonies, where we know that the entities, ants or the bees, continue to use the same rules to improve the system. However, in the complex adaptive systems that we're talking about, the attribute of authenticity means that new rules can be created to actually reinvigorate the system. Emergence is a final attribute or dynamic that we consider in this paper, and it essentially points out this phenomena of a whole being greater than the sum of the parts. And in fact, creation occurring, which allows unplanned bottom-up activity to create something that in fact is positive and that was not anticipated. Now, the relevancy of CAS in business is perhaps summarized by this quote from Pascal in his book, Surfing the Edge of Chaos. He says, complexity makes the strategic challenge more understandable and the task of strategic renewal more accessible. And that's precisely because when we think about the kinds of 5 attributes that I had just gone over, is that this sheds a different kind of energy or provides a different energy into any strategic challenge and allows strategic renewal as a result of employing these 5 attributes to become more accessible. So what we will find is that a order or a particular way of thinking about a problem yields to a different way. And here are some examples. So for example, when we think about industry dynamics or even company strengths, we may use something we call Swot analysis, which essentially is an analysis based on strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. But this would transition to something that is more dynamic and organic and is captured by the framework of fishbone diagrams, for instance, or similarly a 5-force framework in which you have a static set of forces acting on a system transitions to ecosystem models, so essentially from linearity to feedback loops and so on. And then process mapping transitions to use of causal diagrams, scenario planning transitions to game theory and system dynamics. Similarly, strategic initiatives transitions to collective vision, which is a more organic approach based on authenticity practiced in autonomous units in interdependent distributed controlled systems. And then the notion of committees transitions to emergent teams, where there again is no top-down mandate on how things should be, but whatever is required emerges from the bottom up. And then the notion of compliance transitions to employee ownership or to participant ownership, so that whatever is coming into the system or the system is faced with can be actually addressed in a different kind of manner. So some guidance on implementing complex adaptive systems. And I'll step back and say that we have implemented these kinds of approaches in a spectrum or portfolio of different organizations that span the structure ranging from a typical hierarchical organization to a much more flat organization. And these attributes work in either of these extremes, and therefore we propose that they can work in any kind of organization. So self-organization, some guidance on implementing this is that instead of planning organizational changes, the organization is going through many changes or mutations on different levels. And that really is how we should think about inserting this notion of self-organization into the system to allow this aspect of mutations to actually happen in real time. So similarly, when we want to employ distributed control, then the control of resources needs to be distributed to teams of people that are using those resources. And the idea of management needs to occur to serve the people and the resources by providing coordination only. So control of the resources is therefore allocated to specific teams of people, but the coordination then remains a management function. And this is an important insight that we've leveraged in the execution of implementing complex adaptive systems. When we think about authenticity, then it's important to enable people to express and use all their abilities, even if these are not defined in their job description. And this is the important point, is that we have to be willing to step outside of the confines of a job description when we're thinking about implementing or allowing this property of authenticity to emerge organically in such a system that we want to be a complex adaptive system. So authenticity, as I've suggested earlier, it can be enabled both in hierarchical and flat organizations. And in both scenarios, it's going to require a different approach from professionalism that most companies expect from people, in that there has to be a little more flexibility allowed for the authenticity that people carry within themselves. And this can become a barrier easily, because many times an organization will always expect that things will be done in a certain way, and we are suggesting that we need to deviate from that sometimes. The notion of interconnectivity and guidance on implementing that is that we have to move away from this notion of defined interactions. So there's too many defined interactions, and this can become a toll on people's ability to perform tasks. What we propose is that there has to be a paradigm of random interactions that essentially require no planning, that is injected into the system. And we have seen that usually the most value is the outcome of random interaction rather than a defined interaction. One way to increase randomness, for instance, is to organize rotation or move people between groups. And this will increase interaction, and this will allow different kinds of random thinking, quote unquote, random thinking to occur. The way to implement or inject the notion of emergence into a system is to essentially give groups the ability to do their work and to address their challenges by themselves, and also to allow them to make mistakes. And this notion of allowing mistakes becomes very important, so people can then begin to experiment in a different way, and this experimentation will cause emergence to happen. Now, in this paper, we go over two different companies. One is Zappos, which is a flat organization. The other is Nucor, which is a hierarchical organization. I was previously head of organization sciences at Zappos. And so in the interest of time, I'll just very briefly talk about a couple of points of how we actually implemented some of these properties. And I'll focus on self-organization, for instance. So at Zappos, one of the mandates was that, or one of the ways of thinking was that everybody was equal. However, different people played different roles. So while there is a democracy in place, each person is filling a role, and that role has certain decision rights. And this became a necessary requirement for self-organization to work, where you have that clarity and where then different kinds of initiatives can emerge spontaneously due to the roles that are in place and due to the decision rights that set a level playing field for the democracy in practical terms. Another example of is I'll talk about is that of distributed control, where we had this notion of circles. And so you can think of circles as being extended teams from perhaps on the low side, 5 people to 25 or 30 people. And these circles were endowed with decision rights over certain domains. So whether the domain was, for example, you can think about employee retention as being a domain, or you can think about, say, the need to maintain a certain market share as being a domain. But each of these domains has decision rights attached to it, and these decision rights belong to circles, and that's how essentially distributed control comes into being, because then you have these independent circles that exercise decision rights over specific domains. In the interest of time, I'll skip forward and just offer some conclusions. So what we have found is that the use of complex adaptive systems and essentially the 5 attributes that we've introduced in this paper increase the sense of ownership and belonging amongst employees. And this becomes an invaluable asset for any organization, because it allows then people to make decisions and execute them, so long as all the domains and decision rights have been clearly defined up front, so that you don't have a group, say, crossing over and making a decision in some area that they do not have the expertise in, for instance. Another conclusion is that CAS, this kind of implementation of CAS enables companies to increase variety without increasing complexity. And this is a very difficult problem usually, because when you increase variety, you always increase complexity. However, if we follow these 5 attributes as the paper defines, then you can increase variety without necessarily increasing complexity, and that becomes a great advantage for any organization, especially during times of ambiguity or great change. There's also a huge improvement in customer satisfaction, and this is usually driven by the fact that you have customer service representatives that are now empowered to make decisions that essentially can delight a customer. Essentially, also what we have found is that CAS turns organizations from being reactive to becoming responsive. And this is a great asset also for any company. Finishing projects on time and in budget, when these 5 attributes as defined in the paper and presentation are followed, becomes much more of a reality. And again, that's a huge gain for any organization. It also allows for continuous improvement and increasing efficiencies. And finally, it allows an organization to increase competitive advantage due to the creation of better and cheaper goods or services. Thank you.